All right. Hey guys, welcome back to Critical African Thinkers. This is a place where we examine everything and nothing escapes us. So we examine everything under the microscope of logic to ascertain that which is most factual and logically consistent. So today I have a very special guest in the person of Dr. Sheena Mason, and we are going to be exploring the concepts of racelessness and colorblindness and the theories surrounding race and all that. So when I bring my guests in, I usually like them to do the introductions to themselves. So I just like Dr. Sheena to tell my audience and tell me a little bit about herself, about her work, and about her qualifications to talk about an issue such as this. So, over to you, Dr. Sheena.
Thank you so much, Charles. So, I'm Sheena Mason. I recently graduated from Howard University. I earned my doctorate in English literature. I specialize in African American, Caribbean, and American literature. And my dissertation turned forthcoming book um, focused primarily on interrogating and critiquing what's being called the anti-racist movement, and is especially solution oriented. So the theory of racelessness, something we'll talk about today, is really at the heart of what my book is, and is also reflective of how I approach teaching, how I do consultation and coaching work through my business theory of racelessness. Um, One thing that attracts me to critical African thinkers is this idea of nothing escaping us and examining things through logic. And the theory of racelessness, I think you'll find, really pushes toward that goal ultimately, so that we can be more clear-eyed and astute in the United States and elsewhere about what is racism, how does it impact us, and importantly, if we come to agree that racism exists in some way, how do we solve it?
Oh, great, fantastic. So that seems like a very good portfolio for someone to talk about this. So my first introduction to you was one of my audience drew my attention to the fact that you mentioned my channel in Brittany King's a live stream where there was Kimi Katiti, who I had here some time ago, and Brittany King and some other persons. So I checked you out, and yeah, it was interesting. The concept of racelessness, color blindness. Although I haven't gotten a full grasp of those concepts yet, and I'm hoping that I'll leave this meeting much more enlightened about it today that you're here. So it's interesting, but I would like us to start. What are some of the philosophies surrounding race? What are some of the philosophies surrounding race, especially as it relates to the discussion right now in the United States and in some other parts of the Western world? And so people know I am in Nigeria, I'm not in the United States, I'm not in any Western country, but these things interest me. So I like to talk to people about these things, and I've had a couple of guests in from United States too. So tell me, what are some of the philosophies surrounding race and racism in America?
Yeah, so a lesser known fact is that within the field of philosophy, there is a specialization which is focused on philosophies of race. So, where some people can focus on the classics, you can also specialize in philosophy of race. Now, all of us hold two positions, at least, two philosophical positions of race, even without having the name for it. Three of the positions tell you what a person believes race is, and three of the positions tell you what a person believes should be done with race. So, of the three that tell you what a person believes race is, there's naturalism. Naturalists argue that race is biological. That is, it is something in our DNA, that humans are divided into subspecies and categories apart from each other, very different, that there is an essence to it, that your parents and your ancestry determines your race. In the United States, the default and perhaps the most common philosophical position is the next category, which is social constructionism, or constructionism for short. Constructionists argue that race, like gender, is a social construction. That, okay, race isn't of nature, it's not biological, but because of how racism plays out in society, race is rendered real in the socially constructed sense. Now, my position in response to a sort of constructionist position, I point to the fact that in the context of the United States, many people talk about race, they call it a social construction, but then they talk about it in fixed ways, that is, as if race is of nature, as opposed to, indeed, a social construction. So I think that that's the biggest limitation in viewing race as a social construction. And the third and last category that speaks to what a person thinks race is called skepticism. Skeptics like myself, we argue that race is not of nature, and it is also not a social construction. My own skepticism tells me that how the things that people point to as race or being racial are actually being confused. It's more like something cultural, it's something national, something ethnic. It is not, in fact, race or that which is racial. So in that way, I'm a skeptic. So the theory of racelessness, the word racelessness, then signals my skepticism in that sense. Indeed, humans, there's one race, right? The human race. And in that way, all of us are raceless. Now, on the other side of this, what do people think should be done with race? So you can be a conservationist, which means you believe that race should be conserved as an idea. Probably you're going to be a naturalist because, after all, how can you reconstruct or eliminate something that is of nature, right? You can be a reconstructionist. And similar to the constructionist position in America, which is promoted and privileged and prioritized, it's my argument that we are taught to be reconstructionists as well. Reconstructionists argue that for whatever variety of reasons, the idea of race should be, can be, must be reconstructed to mean something else, usually something more positive. So in popular discourse happening in the US, since for as far back as we could go, really, you see a clear effort to reconstruct what it means to be racialized as Black in the country. And even things like hashtags, Black excellence, Black girl magic, Black is beautiful, those are reconstructionist efforts. And then the third and final category that speaks to what a person thinks should be done with race is the position I hold, which is eliminativism. Now, eliminativists like myself, the word is a misnomer because it kind of suggests, it suggests that eliminativists like myself believe that the idea of race or race ideology, and by extension racism, can be fully eliminated. But to me, it is not a zero-sum game. That is to say, I don't actually think that in American society, or probably in any society, the idea of race can be eliminated completely, because I don't think racism can be eliminated completely. However, I do believe that we can get to the statistical majority of people viewing themselves and other people as indeed raceless, that this would go a long way toward getting us across the finish line in terms of how racism does have a negative impact on people. And so for me, ultimately, eliminativism is the way to go. And the one thing I like to add to and point out is the Reconstructionist effort. The idea of race has been under Reconstruction since its inception. In early modern Europe, the word race came to mean and refer to largely ethnicity, nationality, class was informed in what race was perceived as. And it wasn't until 1670 or so, in the context of the United States, where race started to mean Black, white, person of color, brown, etc. And it started to get codified in the way that we think of it now. So that's my argument essentially against a strictly Reconstructionist position, because if Reconstruction were going to work, then it would have, my argument is it would have worked already.
Oh, so great summation. So if I get you very clearly, you said that there are basically three theories or three philosophies of race as relates to racism: the naturalist, and we have the skeptic, which is what you are, and we have the constructionist. So the naturalists believe that race is biological, that race is biologically determined, and the constructionists believe that race is socially constructed, that people are racialized by societal norms. And someone like you believes that it is neither constructionist or naturalist. Okay, I find your position a bit difficult to hold on to, because if we want to look at, I can sympathize with the two other positions, the two previous positions, race being biological. I can look at it in a way and say, oh, there are ways that I can say that race is biological because there are certain phenotypical characteristics which derive from our DNA, from our genetics, that are expressed. For example, I have tough, kinky hair. A white person has straight hair. You understand? So, how much of that, how can you look at something like that and say, oh, race doesn't exist biologically, when if I reproduce with another black woman, we're going to produce children that look exactly like us with those same phenotypical characteristics. If a white or European person reproduces with another white or European person, they're going to have typical European features that you can predict. You understand? And on the other hand, when you look at the constructionist, it doesn't matter how you see yourself in a society, people are going to put you in a racial category. So whether or not you believe race exists, people are going to treat you based on how you appear. People are going to treat you based on how the society has built a conception of race. So to me, those two positions are very tangible and they're very real. But your position, so you have to, this is me just pushing back. So you have to give me more why you think that your position would even take root in the first place, given that the other two positions are very strong on their own. Yeah.
Yeah, I would argue that the other two positions are very weak on their own. First and foremost, the categorization of Black, white, Asian, etc. But for the purpose of this conversation, we'll focus on Black and white. Those categorizations and our understanding of who is Black and who is white goes back all the way to the days post-emancipation, right? Or before, during enslavement, and around 1670, when they started to create laws, anti-miscegenation laws, they started to create laws that cast Blackness and being Black as being enslaved. And they started doing things like calculating, okay, based on this number of white folk on a family tree and this number of Black folk on a family tree, at what point does a person stop being Black? At what point does a person start being white? All of these things, which is infamously known as the one drop rule, right? So race, we take phenotype and physical expression of ethnicity, and we translate that as signaling or signifying that race is real. But indeed, it's so fictional and pseudoscientific, it makes me giggle, because ultimately, at the end of the day, we are subscribing, many of us, to the one drop rule, to the very thing that was created only to subjugate and continue to enslave people racialized as Black in a society. And the people who we would look at today and say are racialized as Black, that were free at that time, those people were written outside of Blackness because they were not enslaved, because they were free. So what is that really telling us about race? And when scientists, for example, when they compare somebody from Kenya to somebody in Ghana, people on the continent of Africa are genetically proven to be more different from each other than they are compared to any other person in the entire world. And racialized Black people express all types of hair textures. We express all types of skin tones. If you look up Gene Toomer, Charles Chestnut, those are just the first people that come to mind. When Walter White. If you look these people up, based on American calculations, those men are Black. If you, I wish I had a pic. I need to carry a picture of these guys around. Those men look like they could be Donald Trump's, great grandfather. Those men phenotypically don't look anything close to what we assign to Blackness and race in that way. So it's not as simple. It's easy to simplify race in phenotypical terms, but when we really pick apart and dig deeper, we come to find that race is far more complicated in terms of how people understand it. And it's so complicated and ironic and contradictory at points that it should be rendered unreal upon further analysis. And then the last thing I'll say too is, in American society, at least, we tend to conflate race with ethnicity or race with culture. And so some of the things that you're talking about that can be expressed through a person's DNA would be, I would argue, is ethnicity, right? It's your ethnicity that's transmitted through your ancestry and your DNA, which is not the same thing as race. So part of my argument too is we need to help people see through the smoke and stop thinking about themselves in ways that society really programs us to think, and recognize too that just because society might racialize us as any particular thing doesn't mean that racialization coincides with how we racialize ourselves, and it doesn't mean that we have to racialize ourselves at all. There's two ways that people are racialized: by oneself and by society. And I rebuke the idea that I don't have the power and agency to categorize, identify, define, and name myself how I want to name myself, period. And that should be part of any conversation to do with liberation or anti-racism. I define myself how I define myself. And society, they're going to do what they're going to do, but I don't have to participate in it. But then the last thing I'll say is too, my mentor, Dr. Carter, the chair of the philosophy department at Howard University, he says that one can maintain a category while seeking its destruction. So he's a social constructionist and an eliminativist. And so to be an eliminativist, you can be a skeptic or you can be a constructionist. The constructionism versus skepticism need not be the reason why you don't see the value in eliminating race.
All right. So looking at what you've said, it makes a whole lot of sense. It's getting clearer. But let us go towards ethnicity, what you describe as ethnicity. If we want to go by the route of ethnicity, how many ethnicities do you think would be in existence?
Countless.
Countless ethnicities. So you know
absolutely.
Something about the human mind. The human mind likes to categorize things, likes to put things systematically, and likes to group things. Somehow it makes it kind of function easier. So it takes things that have similar characteristics and lump them up together and say, okay, these belong to this category. Now, looking at race, if you want to look at it from the social constructionist angle, you can see that based on certain expressed characteristics, people are put into certain categories. Now, I can subscribe to that ideology because I feel that phenotypically, Asians are similar and phenotypically Africans are similar, even though there is a lot of genetic diversity. That you can make that argument for anything. There's genetic diversity between two people. There's genetic diversity between siblings. There's genetic diversity between twins. So it's only a matter of degrees. You get it? But in a broader sense, even though Africans are genetically diverse, they are still much more coherent compared to measuring Africans as a whole with Europeans, or measuring Africans as a whole with, say, the Asian. So you get what I'm saying? So in that sense, it makes sense for race to exist as a broad category. Now, where I think the issue of why it seems that race should be eliminated is the fact that because of the negative connotations that comes with race and racism, how racism somehow is perpetuated by the very existence of race. But I can very well assure you that even if race is abolished today, the issues that we term racial are not going to disappear. Let me use Africa as an example. So the concept of race really does not, it would not make sense in the African context, because somehow in their broad categorizations we are of all the same racial group. But this issue of discrimination, this issue of bigotry, the issue of favoring one particular set of people over another based on heritage still exists. You get, which is basically what's happening in the case of race, but now it's because these people are phenotypically different. Like in my country, okay, there was a video that was going around a few days ago about a traffic officer uh, who caught someone breaking the traffic law, and the guy was required to pay a fine. So he was driving the guy's car and they were having a conversation. He didn't know he was being recorded. And he was saying something that, I'm helping you out because you are the same ethnic group as myself. If you were, that this is our policy, that based on our brothers, we usually like helping each other. See, but if it was the Igbos or the Hausas, those are two other ethnic groups in my country. You get. You say if it were the Igbos, we're going to treat them, we're going to show them this. If it were the houses, we're going to show them this. You understand? So the problems that you want to eliminate by eliminating racism is still going to be there, because people can still see there's a difference between myself and this person, either in terms of phenotype or some other characteristics. People are still going to characterize themselves or categorize themselves. So how do you deal with that? Don't you see that as kind of a weak point in the argument of trying to say, let us abolish race? But before I hand over to you, um, um, in my country's earliest history, two of the greatest political leaders, one from the north and one from the south, were having a discussion. And then the one from the south said, "Oh, let us forget our differences. Let us abolish our differences." To which the one in the south north said, "No, let us understand our differences." I think I want to go with the one from the north about understanding our differences, because you can't wish away differences, but you can only wish to understand it and how you can work with it and make a better outcome for everybody. So respond.
Yeah, so a few things. I'm going to try to say this coherently. Um, Importantly, I argue that racism masquerades as race. In the American context, racism masquerades as race. So the things that people often point to as racial are either being confused as ethnicity or something cultural or something national happening, or it's racism hiding its face as race. I'll give you a example that plenty of people are probably familiar with. In the US, there are plenty of times when the idea that to sound white, to talk white, is to speak in the way that I'm speaking now, what's called standard English, right? Which is an icky term. What's on the other side of that presumption when it comes to race and race identity, etc., is that to sound Black, translation to be Black, is to be uneducated, to sound uneducated, to be illiterate. So there are ways in which the ideas that Americans have about race in American society is actually racism hiding its face. And if that's the case, then we should all be on the side of eliminating, again, not 100%, but just getting to the statistical majority of people viewing race as a historical concept and actually tending to the problems caused by racism, being more clear-eyed about those problems, because right now the tendency is to point to almost anything and everything and say, that's racism, which is a misidentification of the problem, which then has also prevented us from meaningfully solving the problem long term. I will also say that what I call racialist identity, so the racialist is a word that I coined. It's combining the words racial and racist to show the sameness, to show that I see racism as camouflaging itself as race. Racialist ideology literally washes over actual meaningful differences and similarities. And so in the United States, based on what you just said, the idea that, okay, we all have phenotypical differences, and it makes sense that within a particular racialized group, they're more similar, they're dissimilar, et cetera, et cetera. In the United States, the idea that we are a part of a racialized group often equates and translates into this misunderstanding of what phenotype, what significance that actually means in society. How does that play out? In the US, it's like, okay, because I'm racialized as Black and because I look a particular way, I have to participate in a particular culture, which is labeled Black culture, right? And Black culture, because it's attached to race and the word Black is attached to race, Black culture is cast in very essentialized, stereotypical, and yes, racist ways. And last time I checked, not all Black people are the same. Just as all white people are the same, all Asian people are the same. We don't participate in the same culture. We don't speak the same language. We don't eat the same foods. We don't wear the same clothes. And that's true even just in the context of the US. An African American in New York is very different from an African American in California. But because race is attached to us, the United States context, it doesn't matter the differences that we actually have. In some way, somehow, we are always relegated and subjugated to Blackness, which, if it was just a positive thing, then we wouldn't be combating racism in the ways that we're combating. So our insistence that because society tells us it's so, to me is part of the sort of programming and part of the systemic issues at hand, because at the end of the day, the policies of the land are going to reflect the beliefs of the people. And right now, those policies and the beliefs of the people tend to lean toward your pushback a little bit, in the sense that, okay, we're racialized. It's not practical to be not racialized. In fact, it's practical to be racialized. And we have to understand the differences between races and all of that stuff. That's a common presumption, I'll say, and it's a common expectation. But then if being racialized is so great, then why is it that the conservative voices, for example, Glenn Loury, I constantly call on him, or John McWhorter, why is it that those people, their Blackness is often called into question? And historically, this has remained true. As soon as they start to speak in what's called heterodox ways, right? As soon as you start to say something that's outside of the prescription of race, then you're a problem and your race is called into question. Race and race ideology is so insidious. And the fact that we still have other hierarchies based on ethnicity, we have hierarchies in the US based on gender, we have hierarchies based on class, we have hierarchies based on education level, countless things, right? And that's true in a global context, as you pointed out. But the existence and persistence of those hierarchies is not a logical argument against insisting that we do something more and something revolutionary against racism. It would be far better to remove the violence. And then the last thing I wanted to say is that racelessness, either recognizing ourselves currently as raceless or deciding that eliminativism is the path forward, that is not eliminating or abolishing differences. It's quite literally the opposite. Because as I said, racialist ideology as it stands and it has stood for centuries now, it prevents actual meaningful differences among racialized groups and meaningful similarities across intergroup, right, from being recognized and from being brought forth and fully realized. And so the elimination of race as a concept and the pushing it as a sort of historical concept will not just help us meaningfully address racism, both historical and current, but also it will help us and result in a sort of proliferated understanding of ourselves, of our connections with other people that we otherwise are prevented from seeing in the racialist context of American society, and so on. But that is not to say that with the elimination or lessening of race ideology and thereby racism, that we're going to live in a paradise. We're all going to sing Kumbaya. That's not what I'm suggesting here. I'm quite aware that that is not possible. That it'd be nice if it was possible. I just don't see that as being possible. And yet, I still don't think that that's a reason to not solve the problem of racism.
Okay, I see. But like I said earlier, the problems that eliminating race you're trying to solve is not going to go away. It's just going to take on another label, either ethnicity, or what you may call it. Take for example, groupthink, or a particular racial group predominantly thinking in a particular way, and members of that racial group or that racialized group who do not think in that particular way are being ostracized, or they're being kicked out. Let's say like some conservative voices like Glenn Lowry. That happens. But even in a situation where race does not exist, I can speak to this because I'm in Africa, where the concept of race really does not play out. But even in that situation, when you use ethnicity, you find the same thing playing out. Take, for example, the Igbos in my country who are currently fighting for self-determination. They want a nation of their own. So there is sort of a general consensus in terms of those who are pro leaving the union. You get it? If there is any Igbo person who dissents from that position, they will get the same kind of reaction and irritation from their own ethnic group as a Glenn Lowry will get from the Black community. Are you getting what I'm trying to say now? So in this sense, I don't see how abolishing race is going to solve the problem that you think is going to solve. It's just going to push the labels down to another category. It might push the labels down to, I don't know. Let's say ADOS becomes an ethnicity in America, and let's say we have other African groups too. Maybe the African immigrants can identify with their countries of origin as their ethnicity. So Nigerian Americans, Jamaican Americans. You get it? It doesn't solve the problem. It only pushes down the problem to other labels. So it's more like a reconstruction rather than an elimination, because like you admitted, an elimination is not going to be possible, because if it were going to be possible, probably would have happened already. You get what I'm trying to say? Okay.
Yeah.
But we've labeled on this point for a while. And I think you have gotten a sense of where I'm coming from, and I think I've gotten a sense of where you're coming from. So let's move on to another line of questioning. The
Charles,
concept of
excuse me, sorry,
yeah.
Charles, I just want to say, because I just want to point out the fact because this is a crucial and important fact. And to me, it's not a logical argument against my position. And so it's something that I feel I need to insist on making clear so that at least even if you're unconvinced, other people don't go down the rabbit hole that many people I think are going down in terms of practicality, the existence and persistence of hierarchy based on perceived differences, all of that. If the idea of race, if race ideology is eliminated, then the thing that's eliminated is racism, which is the thing that I'm trying to solve. I'm not trying to solve all of the world's problems. I'm not trying to, that would be great, but I am living in reality very firmly. The thing that would be solved is the thing that I'm pointing to and saying, this is insidious. And the way it plays out in American society, whether we want to call it systemic or not, is insidious. And in terms of what would happen if this project is successful, right? The thing that we would probably then turn to and focus on and other each other based on would probably be something like class, because socioeconomic status is also a huge part of this discussion of racism. And so, yeah, but that's not a new hierarchy. That's not a new form of oppression. Those hierarchies that you're speaking of potentially coming to the surface with the abolition, as you call it, of race, i.e. racism, those hierarchies are not new. Those hierarchies are in human society, not just globally elsewhere, but also in America. And so to me, that's like saying, okay, well, this is how humanity is, and so we just have to make the best of it. I think that is a mistake, because at the end of the day, if we can do something to remove a form of violence, even if the other forms of violence are going to persist, to me, the logical thing is to work toward rooting out that source of violence. And the violence that racism has caused for people in this country and continues to cause, the division that it causes, the division that racialist thinking and racialist ideology causes, because then it cuts across into all other types of binaries like conservative or liberal. It's always us versus them, right? A lot of those things will still persist, but liberating yourself or oneself from racialist ideology does and is proving to help people liberate themselves from the other binaries and categories that they put themselves into, to see humanity and literally other people that they often view as their enemy because American society says it so. And so I just wanted to push back on that, because God forbid people listening are unconvinced for the simple fact that hierarchy is still going to exist, because humankind is humankind and we're imperfect in a lot of ways. I still think we're more good than not. And this isn't an effort to solve all of the problems. This is an effort to solve a very particular problem. And the problem would be solved. But that doesn't mean that other problems aren't going to haunt us. It would mean that more of us could turn our attention to those problems, though. Thank you for letting me expound.
Okay.
I know you're trying to.
Give me one example. Yeah. So give me one example of a racism that, as it exists today, that would be solved by eliminating race, by implementing the concept of racelessness. Just one example.
Yeah, so there are studies that show that policies that focus on race, because Americans are so race obsessed, like affirmative action at institutes of higher learning, that those policies, instead of solving the thing it's supposed to solve, like said racism, actually continue to help people who are largely middle class, upper class, children of immigrants, or immigrants themselves, are benefiting from the policies that are supposedly solving racism, because those policies focus on race. When we're able to liberate ourselves from racialist ideology and racialist thinking, the more equipped and the more able we are to recognize that, ironically, to solve racism, the thing that we're pointing to and saying this is systemic, or this is a problem, or this is how racism has a negative impact on communities, we're better able to recognize that those problems are largely based on socioeconomic status. Class is another way of saying it. And so the policies have to be focused on that, as opposed to being focused on race, or what is perceived as race. The sort of inequalities that I think about, I do a lot of work in Mississippi in the Delta, which is like, if you know anything about American history, Mississippi is going to be the bedrock for a lot of racist happenings. And the communities are still largely segregated. The schools are still largely segregated. And the fact that they weren't desegregated with the civil rights movement and all of that stuff has led to the continued pervasion of impoverishment, the continued pervasion of violence, mass incarceration, the achievement gap, all of the things that people don't like to talk about because they feel like that's not evidence of systemic racism. At least in Mississippi and the Delta, it is. And yet and still, even doing the work and being as familiar as I am with that state and the country at large, we cannot solve those problems by focusing on race. But we can't see that that's true until we're able to liberate ourselves even just a little bit from racialist ideology. Because racialist ideology really encourages and enables us to hyper focus everything on race. And that doesn't solve the problem.
Okay, let us explore the concept of colorblindness. That's really the area I'm very, very interested in. I watched the interview with Kimi Katiti and Brittany King and yourself, and I really didn't grasp your position as regards to what you meant by colorblindness. So first of all, explain to me what the broader context of the concept of colorblindness is, and then tell me your position about colorblindness, and then we can work it out from there.
So how colorblindness has been understood is there's a stigma attached to it, right? The idea is that a person who professes themselves to be colorblind is saying, race doesn't matter. I don't see color, which translation, race doesn't matter. And oftentimes when people who are saying they're colorblind, that race doesn't matter or they don't see color, they're also saying that racism isn't a problem, that racism doesn't exist. And we know that even when that's not what people mean, people saying that they're colorblind, that they don't see color, even when we know that that's not what people mean, that's how people interpret what they're saying. So I see this play out on social media on a constant basis. There'll be a picture of the first Black woman to do X, Y, and Z. And people in the comments, somebody every time is going to say, why does race have to be in the equation? You know, race doesn't matter. I don't see color. And then they'll get attacked by the crew of people who come in and say, what do you mean race? What do you mean race doesn't matter? Don't you see my problems? I want you to see me, which is evidence of what I'm saying, that racism masquerades as race. Because if not seeing race is understood as not seeing racism, then that's evidence for my point. And that's how people in society treat colorblindness and professions of colorblindness. So in that way, I differentiate my theory of racelessness from that of colorblindness, because I am very clearly and explicitly saying and conceding the fact that racism continues to be pervasive and has a negative impact on American society, that it exists. I don't question or doubt it for a second, which again is not aligned with what a lot of professions of colorblindness articulate. And so in that way, it's very different. But I think there's a way in which like Coleman Hughes did something, it was something to the effect of the case for colorblindness. And he was talking, I think at Harvard, and he was talking about the case for colorblindness. I think that ultimately, if colorblindness were understood in the theory of racelessness type of way, where say, okay, yes, racism exists, right? But in a Martin Luther King Jr. type of ambitious way, it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't dictate or determine the outcome of a person, right? Or the life expectancy of a person. That to me is the goal. That race need not dictate and determine the outcome of any person, racialized as anything. So in that way, I'm not against colorblindness, but I do question and push back against folks who say that racism doesn't exist, because that's just false.
Okay, so okay, good. So when someone says they are colorblind, they don't see color. Obviously, they're not saying it in a literal sense. Obviously, they're not saying that um, they do not understand that this person is a black person or this person is a white person. I get the sense that what you're saying is that to me, it doesn't matter that this person is a black person. It doesn't matter that this person is a white person. No, but you flipped it and said that some people perceive when you say you're colorblind, that what you mean to say is that racism does not exist. I doubt if that's the intention of anyone who says they're colorblind. I, I, I want to believe that people who say they're colorblind do understand that racism exists. But in a case where things want to be racialized or things want to be seen through the racial lens, they can be like, it doesn't have to be this way. Yes, this person is black, but we don't have to bring their race into it. This person is white. We don't have to bring their race into it. Can't we all just be humans? That is the sense in which I am saying it. So I believe that your theory of racelessness and the concept of color blindness is somewhat related. Maybe the difference is in your perception of what you think the other person is saying, because nobody would be, or very few people would be dumb enough to think that just because race doesn't matter to me, the race of someone else doesn't matter to me, does not mean that that person is not facing certain challenges because of their race. Because after all, you're not just the only two individuals that are existing within that space or within that country. So even if you're not going to be racially prejudiced against this person, someone else may be racially prejudiced against them. But speaking for yourself, you can say, well, I'm colorblind. It doesn't matter whether this person is white. It doesn't matter whether this person is black. So that is the sense in which I am getting the concept of colorblindness, about which you
Well,
seem to differ with.
yeah, because I've studied, this was part of my PhD work. I've studied the idea of colorblindness. I had a couple of my committee members bring up colorblindness and ask me what's the difference between what I'm saying and colorblindness, because colorblindness is viewed as being very problematic in most circles, in most woke circles, I'll say. And so the books that are out there on the idea of colorblindness, like Patricia Williams's book, for example, on the paradox of race, she talks about how this is an actual thing. Like most people, not all people, but most people who profess to be colorblind also refuse to acknowledge the existence and persistence of racism. And that's why the idea of colorblindness has become such a hot topic. It's why I get asked about it inevitably with almost every conversation I have, at least initially. People want to know what's different about it, because they recognize that the traditional understanding of colorblindness and how it traditionally plays out in society is understood to be a problematic one, and they don't want to be on the quote wrong side of the topic, if you will, or of the issue. And so that to me too is a sort of case study for how people perceive colorblindness even still, because Patricia Williams' book is like 1997, like a minute ago. And even still, colorblindness has a bad rap. That's why there's so much pushback to people who not just say, I don't see color, but also people who respond to certain situations and say, oh, there's one race, the human race. People respond to those assertions actually very negatively, which would be surprising because you would think, what is the person articulating there that could be interpreted as a negative? And yet we know that how people receive that language and the track record of it is such that there is a stigma attached to it. And so kind of to your point, well, also I will say, I don't see, aside from asserting that racism does exist and persists clearly and explicitly, I don't see a huge difference between the theory of racelessness and colorblindness, except for the fact that colorblindness, the idea often espoused behind it, is such that race doesn't matter, right? Or race shouldn't matter for that matter. And as a skeptic, I don't concede that race exists. So then if there is another main point of differentiation, that would be the different differentiation that matters. That being said, there are plenty of people who see themselves as colorblind who would find themselves to be on board with my theory of racistness, right? Because it's not a far cry from what their ultimate goal is, which I think is one of eliminativism in a lot of ways.
Okay, so one of the issues you say you have with colorblindness is the presupposition that people who believe they are colorblind at times deny that racism exists just for the mere fact that
that's not
colorblind.
That's not my point of contention. That's what I'm saying. Society's point of contention is the discourse. When you look at the literature and you study how it plays out, that's me acknowledging how society views it. That's not my view of it.
But that also informs your skepticism towards colorblindness, right?
No, my skepticism is because of my racial skeptical positionality, my philosophy that race doesn't exist. So I wouldn't say that race shouldn't matter, because I would say race doesn't exist, so it can't matter. And that's a key philosophical difference between folks who say race shouldn't matter or doesn't matter, or I don't see race. They're still acknowledging the existence of race, if you will. Whereas my skepticism, at least at this moment, prevents me from doing that. Now, I wasn't always a skeptic. This is really, I would say within the last 6 to 7 months, this has been where my journey has taken me. Before I was a constructionist, right? But yeah, my skepticism now would not allow me in good conscience to be like, oh, race doesn't matter, or I don't see race, because to me, it doesn't exist.
Okay, I have an issue with the concept that race doesn't exist, because it clearly does, whether by natural means or by a social constructionist means. It's a different question of saying race shouldn't exist and saying race doesn't exist, because it clearly does currently. So if the goal is to say race shouldn't exist because it shouldn't matter, then it seems to me to be a much more plausible position than to say race doesn't exist when it clearly exists at this point in time. Even if it never existed from the beginning of human civilization, but at a certain point, the concept of race came into existence, and as such, it does exist. Because if I want to push that line of thinking forward, if I want to stretch that line of thinking, I can say, okay, you believe race doesn't exist. Therefore, racism doesn't exist, because the very idea of racism itself is hinged on the existence of race. So as it currently is. Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I find humor in things that probably aren't humorous. No, so this goes back to the central part of my argument, which is that racism masquerades as race. So race doesn't exist, but racism does. And racism created race and continues to create it and continues to enable the idea of race to persist. And in fact, the persistence of racism depends on the persistence of people believing in race. And so in that very fundamental way, there's a difference, and it's not just semantics between what you're saying and what I'm arguing, which is primarily that whereas many Americans and other folks view race as causing racism or as inspiring racism or as like the differences between races is seen and perceived, and then that creates racist ideas. I argue that racism came first. And when we look at the literature and we look at the historical records of people when they're first starting to create race ideology, and before, during, and after the time that they start to codify the words black, white in the ways that we talk or think about it now, when we look at that information, we see that their racist ideas about the people that were different from them, that looked different from them, not even were, but just simply based on looks that were different from them, they started attaching blackness to Satan and the devil and morality and immorality, and they started attaching blackness to one's physical health, that a person, if your skin is darker, your body holds more bile, which is causing your skin to be darker. Like, they really started to create all of these explanations for the differences that they perceived, and they started to write race in that way. And it was ultimately their sort of colonialist, imperialist, you name it, just humanness, if we want to say that humans see differences and need to categorize. Okay. I mean, I guess it's true because historically that's been the trend. It's like their perception of the differences weren't the problem. Their perception of the differences were the problem. Their racist ideas were the problem. And they started to create race in very particular racist ways, which is why I argue we can't reconstruct race to be anything other than what it is, which is racism hiding its face. We can't do it because, whereas Americans say that race causes racism, I'm saying the exact opposite. And it's not a matter of semantics, because if it were, then I probably wouldn't be so passionate and vocal about it, for one thing. But we know that language informs thought and thought informs language, and that ultimately informs behavior and action, right? And so the way we think about a thing informs how we act about a thing. So anyway, Barbara and Karen Field's book, Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life, is one book that I like to point people to if they're unfamiliar, as they sort of make the case and prove, as a historian and sociologist, some of the core ideas that I'm expressing today.
Okay, the concept of racism causing race, racism being the root of racial categorizations. This is the first time I'm hearing this, but it's sort of, I'm finding myself agreeing a little bit with it, but I cannot go in all in right now. I have to ruminate through it and see how much more sense there is to it, how much more logic and legitimacy there is to that idea. But I think you're onto something there. So let me just follow this up with a question that has been posted in the link here, although I will still open it up for people to call in. What do you think about assimilationism? Is the concept of racism, racelessness, is it going to be synonymous with assimilationism, just assimilating into the wider culture that you find yourself in? Like, if Black people are in America, which is dominated by white culture, should they somehow become subsumed within the white American culture to just create a simple American culture rather than a distinct white and a black culture. So what do you think?
I think that, so this is where this part of my own thinking is something that I'm still shaping, but also, truth be told, I'm still shaping all of my ideas, right? Because I don't stay stagnant. I expose myself to all sides of positions, right? Constantly and persistently, because I'm always trying to expand and also track my thinking. So I'm still thinking through this, but in the moment, that I would say that if we actually achieved a raceless society, in that racism stops hiding its face in race and race ideology becomes a historical concept, I firmly believe that it would result in the proliferated understanding of culture and ethnicity in the American context, at least, as opposed to this sort of unintentional, or maybe for some people intentional, um, erasure of said ethnicities and cultures. Um, I also think that there's something to be said about the fact that America and American, those words, the idea of the two, have been written to mean and signify whiteness in ways that also enable the kind of hierarchies we've been talking about to persist. And I think that for now, some African Americans are Pan-Africanists. This is not their goal, right? They would prefer to be segregated and have their own black state in a lot of instances. But for other African Americans like myself, I would say that part of the project should necessitates us writing ourselves into what is American, which is not the same as saying we need to like forget ourselves and our history and all of a sudden be, we're trying to be white by trying to be American. I think that the fact that the word American is even understood as often signifying white and whiteness, and everyone else gets hyphenated in, I feel like that continues to serve and prop up the disparities and the systems of oppression that we've been talking about. So the elimination of that and the sort of clearing of the smoke, if you will, would enable us to write ourselves into American in America, which does not have to mean and shouldn't mean. And I would
Hello?
say, oh, hello? Charles, are you still here?
Yeah, I'm here. The video is it's kind of paused, but I can still hear you. Let's go ahead. Are you still there?
Okay, yes, I'm still here. Um,
Okay. So let me ask you this. What are those steps, those specific steps that we need to take in creating um, a raceless society?
that's a tricky question because my skepticism, the skeptic in me says it already exists. And so in that way, the first step one is actually educating people on philosophies of race, that there are alternative ways to view race, to view oneself, to view other people that I think have been intentionally kept from mainstream knowledge. And if we can do that, the more people that are educated on the six philosophical positions, the more people are, I guess, more readily persuaded, if you will, by given the evidence, given their own experiences, given their own ideas, and given their own desires for society. Sometimes I'm finding it as easy as simply educating people on the philosophies, but that's certainly step one. And once people are educated, and if they come to the conclusion, even if they're not a skeptic, they're a constructionist, they still identify themselves as black, white, Asian, whatever, but they're viewing eliminativism as the intended goal, then those people inevitably start to move differently. They start to teach their children different ways in the philosophies of race, right? And stop racializing their children. They go to their jobs differently, show up differently, and they share their ideas, and they share books and resources, and they share podcasts like mine. Just like other ideas get put into and end up proliferating in society, this idea, right, of racelessness as being already in existence, but also the intended goal, can be espoused in the same and similar way. It just takes the statistical majority. And I hold on to hope that because a fair number of people already believe in colorblindness already, for example, and then another big amount of people actually want to do work against racism and solve it. It's my sincere belief that there is hope that it can and it will happen, and it's just a matter of time. But step one,
Okay.
philosophies.
Okay, so final question before I bring in other people to join the discussion. So tell me, what are the greatest challenges to, or the greatest obstacles to the realization of this raceless society that you have identified?
Yeah, so the biggest challenge that I've found is that people almost inevitably misconstrue what I'm saying and run into the complete wrong and opposite direction. And then it's unfortunate. I don't know if this is a human thing, if it's an American thing. I don't know what it is. But it seems like once you've decided that you disagree with somebody, the conversation ends. There's nothing after that, right? So I guess that really just speaks to my own biggest obstacles of making sure that I'm framing my argument in a way that can reach more people, that people will be more inspired to grapple with and work to understand, as opposed to just automatically dismissing it. Like this question of colorblindness that came up earlier. You know, some people, if they perceive, oh, this is the same thing as colorblindness, unlike Charles, that's not a positive thing, and they just might be inclined to discount what I'm saying. But if people are able and willing to stay a little longer and really think through some things, then it ends up being really generative.
Okay. So guys, the link is in the comment section. You can call in. Let's have more voices in this conversation. Let me just post it again. But before then, so what happens if people who subscribe to your ideology of racelessness begin to make that mistake of colorblindness, of saying racism doesn't exist? How are you going to deal with a situation like that?
I mean, outside of saying that it does exist, it being true to my own knowledge and operating from that place and trying to help people see and recognize how it does exist, there's not much else I can do, right? Because the intended goal isn't for everyone to think exactly the same or to even know exactly the same things. If the ultimate goal is shared, the ultimate goal of racelessness is shared, I almost think it might matter less how we get there, because the goal is shared after all.
All right. Okay. Great session with you so far. I must say that it's been an interesting conversation. Really enjoyed myself getting to learn new concepts, and don't you see, my style of interviewing people, even if I agree with you, I'm going to push back a lot because it makes for a more interesting conversation. You get it? So do not see my disagreements as a sign of I don't agree with you. I may just agree with you, but I need you to flesh out your points more in a way that more people will understand what we're talking about. So we have Chloe and we have Stanley in the conversation. So Chloe, jump right in, then Stanley will follow.
Yeah, I've can you hear me just fine?
Yeah, we can hear
Okay.
you.
So yeah, this has been a really interesting conversation for me, and this is kind of it's a really great way of summarizing kind of things that I've come to the conclusion of because, I basically was brought up with the whole concept of racial social constructionism, right? And so it's like this is what makes us black, and it's very heavily this idea of oppression is what makes us black here in America, right? And I was kind of believing that, but I got to a certain point where I had to actually take a step back, a look at my life, and if I look at it, I mean, it's like, am I black really? Because I really haven't had that much, you know, um, of those types of struggles or oppression. I grew up in Alaska where less than 3% of the population is black. So there really isn't anti black racism. There's more anti native racism because they're a bigger portion of the population. And so, like I've never had an issue of getting access to anything I wanted really. I went to university. I got a degree in STEM. It was never like a how do you feel as a black woman in STEM. Everyone just treated me like it was normal, right? No one ever called out my race. And then I got a job. I moved down to the lower 48, and that's when I kind of felt a little bit more like, oh, maybe I should kind of, I don't know, I kind of got believing into it a little bit more kind of socially. But at the end of the day, if you looked at, when people heard about my life outside of, the context of race, everyone thought I was white, right? And so, because used to write for Quora as a top writer, and I didn't reveal my race until I became top writer, and then people were like, "Oh, I thought you were a French woman," right? And so, and they knew kind of enough about me. I didn't hide the real things about my life. I just never mentioned I was black, and so, people's reaction to me, kind of, or at least the details of my life, don't really speak of this social construction of black. And then there's also kind of the idea I've thought of, like, I can't stop people from categorizing me as something, but I can change how I identify myself, which will change my decisions. Because if I identify, quote unquote, as a geek, as a nerd, then a Comic-Con comes to town. In order to enact that identity, I have to, the thing that a nerd would do is to buy a ticket and go to Comic-Con, right? But if I don't identify as that, I'm under no obligation to go to Comic-Con or anything like that. So it's kind of, for me, it's freeing, right? And I don't have to think about, oh, a black person would do this or a black person wouldn't do that. And same thing as, like, a nerd would do this or a nerd would do that. It's like, I'm just going to do what I want to do without constraining myself and trying to live up to an identity that's, somewhat performative.
Wow. Wow. That's good. Chloe, that's good. So, Stanley, go ahead. Jump right in.
Okay, thanks. Hey, actually, I walked away from my notebook. Um, I have a question about Western civilization. I mean, I don't see how racelessness and Western civilization are even going to be compatible. And quite frankly, assimilationism, I don't see how racelessness is going to be compatible. Main reason being is this country and Western Civ, they are literally built on a bedrock of of racism, race and racism. And I mean, you're gonna wind up, deconstructing the whole thing, which brings up CRT. Um, if basically my question is how would you teach racelessness in K through 12, especially in light of of racelessness not being compatible with basically America.
All right. So,
I
Dr.
mean,
Sheena, I'd
I'm
like you to
afraid
respond.
teaching racelessness would be basically, it would be treated like CRT is currently treated. You know,
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
anything new seems to, ruffle feathers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Stanley, Chloe, thank you so much for chiming in and joining the conversation. First, if I could, Chloe, I just want to say thank you for speaking your truth. I actually have family in Anchorage, so that's interesting. It's not every day or often that I hear from somebody who's from Alaska. But yeah, this idea that you are questioning, are you Black? Because at least in the American context, Blackness is understood, the Black experience, right? It's understood as meaning the experience within a racist society. And while Blackness is also understood to expand outside of that, of course, and include other things, when most people in America say something like the Black experience, that's precisely what they're intending to mean, is the experience in a racist society. And so I've had this question with I've had this conversation with countless students. My students last semester at California Lutheran University looked me in my eyes and told me that LeBron James, Jay-Z, we were talking about the super wealthy, racialized Black people, telling me that it matters if somebody has racist ideas toward those men. And then we spoke about how LeBron James, there was that sort of incident where somebody painted the N-word in his driveway or something like that, and he was outside crying and he recorded it. But then you have other people like Michelle Obama talking about her daughters, how she's fearful whenever they get in the car. God forbid an officer mistake them for somebody and they get into some kind of thing. And Glenn Lowry comes behind and says, really, Michelle Obama, like you are not worried about the safety of your daughters. There is this question of, are the Obamas, Jay-Z, Beyonce, once you've made it in a way, at least economically, especially in a capitalist society, are you still Black? Is your experience still part of this larger Black experience as it's understood? And to me, the short answer is no, right? Because Blackness and the Black experience has been understood for a very, very long time as being part of racism. And so if you've made it in that way, people can still be racist towards you, but I mean, free yourself individually to not let somebody saying the N-word toward you impact you, because you literally have generational wealth. You've beaten you've beaten the odds, so to speak. The rest of your family line is probably set for life. So to my mind, what does it matter if somebody has a racist idea about you? That's my feeling about it. And if that's the case, then that's evidence too that whiteness and Blackness or race have become metaphors for racism. That's part of what I mean when I say racism is hiding its face. Because if to be Black is to be understood as subjugated and oppressed in a racist society, and then to be white is to be privileged, right? Or to have access to power, even if not having power, then, or also to be racist is to be white in American society. Usually that's a generalization. Then yeah, that's racism masquerading itself and playing as metaphors in racial categories. And that's, sorry.
Well, when you're done, let me know, because your definitions of race and racism, I would like to flesh that out but I'll let you finish. I'm sorry.
So I guess that what you're saying about the N-word and everything like that, of that, like white people having the power to say it to Black people. This is gonna sound weird to mention like this guy named Jeffree Star, a lot of controversy, right? But like, you know, he got into a lot of trouble, you know, it's like, oh, that he's racist because there was this video of him yelling the N-word at people on the street, just screaming at them. But they only kind of caught the part of the film in which he was yelling it, right? But if you actually looked at the whole video, he's actually yelling it at white women. So you know, it's like, oh, he's racist, but like it kind of, it's interesting. And I guess it kind of goes into like the whole, even like the PewDiePie thing of where he got caught saying the N-word, but he wasn't, there were no black people there. It became like this concept of you know, kind of its own category. You know, it is connected to race, so people were, you know, thinking that he was conceiving a black person was playing the video game and he was frustrated with that person. But it, from what I can tell, even the shift has kind of started even removing that term from race itself. It's slowly becoming its own category. And for people to, you know, scream racism is to smash those things back together, to realign them. And I don't like that.
That's a really interesting point. Yeah. I in my notes to self, I don't know if you guys can see it since you're in here, but I put something about how liberation I've come to recognize is largely psychological. It's largely the sort of liberatory work has to start within the individual, right? In order for anything to happen communally. And part of that liberation, at least for me in my own journey, has necessitated liberating myself from racialist ideology, period. And I think the more of us that could do that, like somebody could call me the N-word, I wouldn't think that they're a very nice person. You know, I'm not promoting or advocating for that kind of behavior, but I would take it certainly as more a reflection of that person and actually having nothing to do with me. Whereas 10 years ago, I was in a very different space in terms of how I perceived that kind of happening. And so Stanley, I wanted to tend to your questions too before you chime in on what I just said about race and racism and my definitions. So I think that part of what people call white supremacy, or I just call it racism, I think part of white supremacy necessitates us to believe that Western civilization is the way that it is, that anti-Blackness or racism, broadly speaking, exists everywhere, at least in the Western hemisphere. I've had countless students tell me that it's global, like racism in the exact way they know it in the American context exists everywhere, or that it exists in Europe because it essentially originated from Europe. I think that that's white supremacy getting the best of us, because part of the problem of racialist ideology too, the problem that is perpetuated is this sense of hopelessness and skepticism that the problem can be solved in the first place. And for all intents and purposes, I think we would do well to hold on to hope and to recognize and believe in the power that we do have, and to assert it for ourselves, even if we recognize that society is trying to hold us back or keep us down, right? To take that for ourselves. And in terms of how to teach racelessness in K through 12. So yes, you're right. The thing that's being called CRT, people are pushing back against it for various reasons. The reasons that I actually outline, and now I am not an expert in CRT, nor am I an expert in what is happening in every K through 12 around the country. But coming from education, Teach for America, Freedom Summer Collegiate, I work with high schoolers regularly. And so I do have some insight into the things that are taught. The thing that's being called CRT and the reasons people are at least articulating why they're against it, to me also reflect the kinds of things that I'm pointing to, which is that racism masquerades as race. So as soon as you go into a space and you start teaching, essentially what people are teaching is race, in an effort to teach about racism in America and systemic racism and all of that. And so to me, it actually makes logical sense that people are going to use that as an excuse or a reason to push back against it. Because what some people are saying, whether we believe they're speaking in good faith or not, is that you're teaching my children to be racist, or you're teaching them to be oppressed and a victim. And people who look all kinds of ways are speaking out against that vehemently. And I think importantly and necessarily, because whether we recognize that that is true or not, when you teach race and you teach and you apply race to students or any person, you are teaching them racism.
I don't agree with that.
So Stanley, I was just going to say, so the theory of racelessness actually removes those barriers from the conversation, so that even if a small percentage of people, let's say 10% of people would still be against it and still find a reason to contend or argue against it. The teaching people philosophies of race, and children would be included in this assertion of people, right? Teaching philosophies of race and then creating a classroom where skepticism is the norm, meaning that nobody is racialized in the classroom, which means nobody is put in a box, either victim or victor. That has more generative potential than our current strategies for trying to accomplish similar, if not the same thing. And so I think that while some people would still speak against it, because you're just not going to make a certain subset of people happy at all, regardless, more people would be on board with this theory of racistness approach, because it would literally be liberating them, their children, etc., from those categories to have more meaningful conversations about the problem.
My definition of racism involves prejudice. You're always going to prejudge if you're going to do racist stuff. Race in and of itself doesn't necessarily have to be racist. I do agree about, a certain amount of neutrality in the classroom. I could live with not talking race in a classroom, but my question would be, how do you teach American history without talking about race?
Yeah, so that's the sort of quagmire that I've even found myself in. I want to talk about the theory of racelessness, and ironically, that necessitates me talking about race almost obnoxiously to the point where people want to argue and combat. And I'm like, well, not for nothing, I keep getting asked questions about it, and you can't expand a person's knowledge if you don't give them the sort of foundation, right, that you have. So like, we have to talk about race. At the same time, I think how we talk about race, if we talk about it kind of how I just did, in terms of whiteness is a metaphor for fill in the blank, Blackness has become a metaphor for fill in the blank, and we can point to historical periods, legal codes, laws, practices, etc., where it's upholding our assertion that whiteness and Blackness have been codified in particular ways that promote the hierarchy, right? That is a very different thing from coming to a space, assuming everyone is racializing everyone, requiring it, even pointing to your whiteness or your Blackness or your Asianness, and then telling you who you are based off of that. I mean, of course, some people are going to find that to be problematic, and it does. Although the goals are very well intentioned, it does limit the conversation, because again, people who look all types of different ways, who are racialized across the spectrum, right, are finding the way that race is being taught and how racism is being taught by extension to be problematic. So those barriers, I think, are removed, and then it would encourage us to talk about race in metaphorical terms as opposed to the sort of fixed ways and terms that we talk about it now. And then the other thing I wanted to say too is something to the effect of how we continue to be taught and to teach our children about racism in the terms of race, which also I think lends to the persistence of the problem. Because just as I said, the solve for racism, systemic or otherwise, ironically sometimes means that the policies needn't focus on or even include race. When we talk about racism in American society, we often talk about it in terms of race, which unintentionally upholds the categories of race and also prevents us, it misdirects the dialogue away from the problem, which is racism, toward the symptom, which is race. And so that's another problematic thing about how we're currently attacking the problem. We're unintentionally upholding the category of race, and we're not speaking about racism in its own terms, if that makes sense. I think we can solve both.
Well, that actually, you just, well, I've got two more questions. Barbara Field's book, I actually happened to have just bought because someone else mentioned it. So pretty much what you're basing your philosophy on, will most of it be covered in their book?
No, because I came across their book after I'd written mine. But my book comes out early 2022. So if you find me on my podcast, which the link is in the description box, then you can keep up. And the book is being published by Palgrave Macmillan, and I talk about all of these ideas.
Okay.
And importantly, I include solutions too.
Okay. Charles Murray, you talked about, teaching race, that sort of thing. I mean, I will definitely read your book. I will definitely follow your podcast, because you've got someone like Charles Murray that literally, I watched him the other day. He said something basically, he doesn't believe that America is intrinsically racist. So the reason he looked to IQ was to prove that, hey, it's essentially what he's saying is he wanted to prove that it wasn't America, it was IQ, and by extension, Black people not having an not being at the top of the IQ chart. Well, he is indicative of how deep the roots go in America. And then the question I never got to ask him, but I will one of these days if I can get a hold of him, name very few American descendant slaves are actually 100% Black. There was so much miscegenation that you've got. I don't know how he can cut hard and fast categories when pretty much everybody's kind of mixed to one extent or another.
Yeah, that's
so
by
that's
our own.
my homily.
Stanley, I'm with you. You're speaking to my heart with that, because you have philosophers like Alain Locke who call American culture mulatto, which goes back to the term of the antebellum days, right? And
right. Well, in New Orleans they had like what, 30 categories?
Right. I think that
was it New Orleans 30 categories?
I think that whiteness, if we actually believe that whiteness exists, like actually believe it exists, even as a social construction, that's to say that there is a pure race. And I just think like how a lot, like, really? So we're going to uphold the category of whiteness and privilege it and elevate it in a lot of ways. People, when they hear theory of racelessness, many people automatically default to, because I talk to a lot of people who are racialized as Black, they default to fear and concern in a way. But I'm like, imagine a world in which whiteness doesn't exist. Just imagine that world. And that's not to say, obviously, hopefully it's clear that I'm saying that white people should be annihilated. I'm saying that white people don't actually exist in reality. They don't. And the sooner we can see that for ourselves, and the sooner we can help racialized white people see that for themselves and embrace that as their reality, the better off we would be.
Can't wait for your Fox News interview.
Oh, I don't know if that'll happen. I don't know if that'll happen. I'm not a conservative, so I don't know that they would have me on there.
Oh, Charles, you're muted.
Oh, I've been speaking. I didn't know I was muted. So I said we have Kevin B. Black in the house. It's been such a long time, Kevin. We've missed you. So welcome to the conversation. So
Hey,
jump
good
right
evening.
in.
How are you? Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
No, just continue with the conversation, man. But I haven't been following up everything that has been said so far, so I'm not sure what you guys are talking about.
Okay, great. So Chloe, you have any more questions for Dr. Mason?
I know. I just find it very, very interesting. And yeah, it does reflect, the things that I've experienced. So one of my friends is Squamish, and so she lives on the reservation in Washington State. And learning from her, like, she's actually an expert on blood quantum, and it's the same thing with the one drop rule. It was an idea that was kind of to enforce the ideas of race. For blood quantum, it was a European idea in order to quantify what makes a native, and then like, oh, there aren't that many natives in this area anymore because they're so much percentage white now the treaty is now void, and therefore now we can take the land because the native people technically here don't exist. But it's interesting hearing from her, like, they, the Native Americans, at least for the Pacific Northwest side, who knows what, Native Americans, also, like, I'm not as informed on the East Coast. But, for them, it's like, if in an ideal world, there could be a white girl who's raised completely on the reservation, and she should be considered native because she's a participant of the culture. And, in order to be a part of the tribe, you have to live in the tribe. And so when she was talking about, like, when people got married, if one person went from one tribe and married someone else from the other tribe, the children would not be considered half of the other tribe. They're of that tribe that they were raised and grown up in. It's just that their mom or dad is from this other tribe. And it's an interesting story for her specific Squamish tribe. And actually, the reason why their culture is kind of so preserved is actually because a black slave girl was adopted by the chief of the tribe. So when a lot of the native people were taken to the Indian schools, they didn't take her, but she had been raised with the culture. So when people were allowed to come back, she just basically retaught the culture because she's black, she's not native, she doesn't need to be quote unquote re-educated to be more white. And that's how, like, their culture was, in a sense, saved.
All right. Dr. Mason, you want to add anything to that?
Well, for some reason, my mind is connecting what you just said, Chloe, to this, I think, relatively new concept of transracial. Have y'all heard about that? Yeah, I can't even.
Yeah, we discussed it a while back. Yeah.
You did? Oh, I'll have to look back at your videos and see that one because I feel like I missed that one. But it's making me think of the transracial discourse that's happening, which is that's a whole other different discussion.
But if we go with your concept, like, that it's ethnicity, right? Or it's culture, right? Because that's, at least for them, it's culture. They don't necessarily say, like, you're of this race or you're that race. They distinguish between culture. And that's what makes the individual. I think that makes it a lot clearer because, I mean, again, like, yeah, a white girl raised on a reservation is more Native American than, like, Irish or Scandinavian or Polish or whatever. You know, it's kind of obvious, but we look at, you know, phenotypes and assume the culture of the person based off of where those phenotypes originated.
Right. Which is, yeah, it's just hugely problematic. I saw a video where this guy identifies himself as Korean. I guess.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Oh, my goodness. And I was just like, first of all, why are we calling that transracial when Korean is not a race? So I'm just going to put that out there.
Yeah, it's a nationality.
Hello. Ethnicity too, right? So it's like, yeah, we need to just throw it all away. But then this is also making me think about how if we even went as far as just relativizing race in American society and showing how it's relative by actually examining other spaces, other times, even across history, that could go a long way toward the goals that I've been talking about. Because as it stands, I think, again, this thing categorized as white supremacy would have us believe that race and thereby racism are the same everywhere, right? But there are plenty of African Americans who actually flee the racism of the United States, like James Baldwin, Toni Morrison. They chose Paris, but people have gone elsewhere, right? And Morrison sort of famously said that she preferred living in Paris because the Parisians weren't obsessed with asking her questions about race. And that was a point of contention for Morrison because she was constantly being racialized, and then her work was just being reduced to that having to do with race and racism. And for her, that wasn't the life that wasn't of interest. And in France, we can say that racism does exist. There's xenophobia, stuff like that. But African Americans in Paris are Americans. So race operates differently. Mm-hmm. So race operates differently in different spaces.
If she was African, she would. I mean, Americans. I've been. I was in the Navy, so I've been a bunch of different places. Americans, African Americans, are pretty much treated as Americans. So, in any case, I do have a question. How would you handle immigration in a raceless society? I mean, you're going to have people that are pretty much inculcated, and you know, wherever it is they come from, they may see themselves as one thing or another. How do you get them? How do you get someone who's, quote, fresh off the boat on board?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it actually it speaks to the sort of idea of relativizing race that I just brought up, because you have people like Baldwin writing on Being White and Other Lies, where he talks about how people who immigrate from countries that are understood as being white, i.e. Europe, right, primarily, to the United States. And when they're coming over here, they're viewing themselves as whatever they are, right? Italian, English, Irish, a combination, whatever. And then in the American context, they are forced, he says, to choose whiteness to fit in. And similarly, there have been plenty of thinkers, Frantz Fanon, who've talked about people choosing blackness. And for better or for worse, people choosing whiteness or people choosing blackness. So in the American context, we presume that people who come from the continent of Africa, for example, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, anywhere, Tanzania, we presume that they identify themselves as Black because they are, after all, on the Black continent in the American imagination. And there are some places and spaces where that might be true. But to be Black in those spaces might mean, and often means, something very different. And it's not a given that every person coming from the continent of Africa actually perceives themselves as Black until they get to a country like the United States, where it's written onto them. And I had a student last semester from Ethiopia say how kind of, I don't know if bamboozled is the right word, but it's the only word I have right now. She was kind of bamboozled when she came from Ethiopia to California because she just wasn't completely aware of race and racism and how it operates in the States. And she wasn't expecting or anticipating people to write that onto her and to lump her into that category. And she had a hard time transitioning and really understanding and like working through that. So I don't think that, so I say all that to say that I think that that's the least of the questions and the problems. And the folks that do come over with an idea of a racialized self, because race is relative and travels differently, it might be the case that I perceive myself as Black or I perceive myself as white, but I'm not bringing with me what those categories mean in American society. Like I saw this interview with a young lady who's from Jamaica. She came to the States and she was saying how she, in Jamaica, from at least her experience, she viewed herself as Black, but that to be Black in Jamaica meant to be Black, to have brown skin, right? To look a certain way, to be Black. It didn't carry with it any of this other stuff that being Black in America carries with it. And she felt some type of way, again, about coming into the American space and people attaching all of this meaning and weight to what it meant to be Black. For her, that was problematic. So I don't think that immigration is really a concern. And I think the people who do immigrate with racialized senses of selves still often view race very differently from Americans.
Yeah.
I
That
don't know. I
Okay.
would think Northern Europeans would probably be closer to, are more familiar with how America deals with it than, someone from another part of the world.
You would think so. And yet, at least the anecdotes that we gave a couple minutes ago, we find that African Americans, you said it yourself, right? African Americans abroad in a place like Paris are viewed as American. But then there's this unequal treatment of people immigrating from different countries in Africa to a European context, and they receive all this kind of marginalization, right, and oppression. And so it's paradoxical because one might assume or presume that racism is going to carry itself in the same way in the European context. But we can't say that it actually does, because if African Americans have the privilege of being American and perceived as American over there, whereas other people immigrating from other quote unquote Black countries aren't, then that complicates it. And I think that might be true. That might be true in the American context too, because there's a lot of research and a lot of scholars who say that people immigrating from different countries in Africa are actually viewed by most Americans as being closer to whiteness than African Americans. And that there is this gap even in identity politics isn't the right term that I'm looking for, but even in how people come over here and don't necessarily see themselves as aligned with the African American cause or what's perceived as African American cause or the Black experience, like Chloe and I were talking about, the experience of being in a racist society. That just because people racialized as Black come into the American context doesn't mean that they see themselves as part of that fight. And it doesn't mean that Americans actually see them as part of the fight either.
Yeah, it sounds like it does come down to like cultural values, because for African immigrants into the United States, they're the most educated immigrant population. And even, when I was in Alaska, when we hung out with other Black families, they were Nigerian. And, when I went to school, one of them was like a mechanical engineer professor. And so I would see him around the campus all the time. And, a lot of them were, petroleum engineers. My dad made friends with him because he's also an engineer at the oil company that he works on to maintain the pipeline. And so that's kind of the vast majority of Black people that I knew in Alaska. And so it's interesting for me, like I guess we're talking about racism, like if there is kind of any prejudice in terms of, you know, my understanding of like who was kind of doing better and who was kind of doing worse intuitively as a kid growing up, I had the intuitive sense that white people were doing worse than, you know, being Black, at least in Alaska, because most of the people I knew were professionals. But yet, you know, you would walk, like, you know, you would drive a certain part of town, or like, you know, the, like, well, it's a rural place, right? And so you would see, like, you know, there are some like trailers with a bunch of broken down cars in front of in their in their front yard, and they had trash, and it's like they were always white. So like that natural association of where people like, you know, X is like tends to be like this and Y tends to be like that. It is shaped by, you know, the categories that you associate in those different circumstances. And so, but talking about the French context, it seems like, you know, again, it's a difference of cultural values, and it seems like, you know, it's immigrants. Like they seems like they're pushing against immigrants coming from cultures that are radically different from France. And I got that impression from watching the movie La Haine, in which it was a Muslim, a Jewish, and a Black immigrant kind of walking around Paris a day around an incident in which there was there's police brutality against, I guess, one of their cousins or something like someone, because they all lived in the same place. And, you know, it was like about to start a riot if the guy died in the hospital. And like the whole movie is really about like all of that tension, and but they left the community and they just kind of farted around Paris for a while, kind of noticing the vast cultural differences between how they live versus how the rest of France lives without the identities that are pinned on them, because I think all three were immigrants. And, you know, they like broke it, they went into like an art gallery and all that kind of stuff. And so, but the fact that they're all three of them were different races, but they all identified with each other based off of their lived circumstances, also I think is telling.
Okay, great conversation. So let me just jump in at this point. So before I make my point, I would just say that I agree with the assertion that it's only in America that this sort of this obsession with race is so pervasive. Because if someone like you, Dr. Mason, were to come to Africa or to come to Nigeria, you will be called a white woman. That's what you will be called. For the simple fact that you're an American, you're going to be called a white person. You understand? So we don't really understand that concept of or that differentiation in as you do have it in America. So for those who are just joining in, maybe let me just recap some of the points. Dr. Mason is still going to touch a few touch about those points before we end the live stream. So basically today we're talking about racelessness as a concept, and also colorblindness, and the philosophies surrounding race and racism, and the philosophies that Dr. Mason herself subscribes to. So, in terms of the philosophies, she highlighted that there were three philosophies surrounding race. And there was the naturalist philosophy that states that race is biologically determined. There was the constructionist philosophy that says that race is socially constructed. And then there is the skeptic philosophy, which Dr. Mason herself subscribes to, who denies either positions. So Dr. Mason basically believes that race does not exist, and that race is wasn't the cause of racism. The fact that, or the idea that race exists was not the cause of racism. Rather, it was racism, the existence of racism, that led to racial categorization, such that people were already being demeaned before they were being put into any sort of racial categorizations. So she also talked about color blindness as a concept where people say the color of the other person doesn't, uh, the race of the other person doesn't matter in any given context, but that there is a sort of a fatal flaw in that ideology, in the sense that it has been observed that society perceives someone who says they are colorblind to mean that racism does not exist in that sense. So that is the sense, or that is one of the sense in which Dr. Mason says her philosophy of racelessness differs from the philosophy of colorblindness. So she is pushing for a raceless society, a society where race doesn't even come into play in the first place. So I believe I've been able to summarize somewhat the conversation that we've had so far. Dr. Mason is still going to tell us a little bit more before we end the live stream. So, Kevin, maybe I've given a little bit of a background to what we're discussing here. So today, what I actually did was to I pushed Dr. Mason. If you go back and watch the video, I pushed her to make sure that she explained her points to be much more explicit, so that we can have a better understanding. Because I always want things to be very simple. Give us in the simplest of terms, such that the layman can understand what concepts we're talking about. And she's been able to do a very good job of it. So, Kevin, jump in if you find
What I
saying
wanted to
misunderstood.
ask, what I wanted, I'm sorry, what I wanted to ask to Dr. Mason was, how do we reach to that state of racelessness?
Kevin, if I crack that code really and truly, I will get a Nobel Peace Prize. I'll be like, I'll have more money than Rihanna. And listen, for all intents and purposes, I am working on cracking the code, but I can say that I have a sort of starting point. How can we achieve it? So in some ways, oh yes, this is going to segue into it. So there aren't 3 philosophies of race, there are 6. So the 3 philosophies that Charles just mentioned speak to what a person believes race is, and then there are 3 that speak to what a person believes should be done with race. So right now, the sort of default position in terms of what should be done with race is a Reconstructionism position, where Reconstructionists argue that for various reasons, the idea of race, the concepts of race can be and should be reconstructed, right? My pushback against that is that we've been reconstructing the idea of race since the word race came into existence. Also, one can be a conservationist. Typically, those people are going to be naturalists because, after all, how can you reconstruct or eliminate race or something that is of nature? And then the third category, which is where I fall into, is called eliminativism. It is a misnomer because, as an eliminativist, I don't believe that we can completely annihilate and eliminate the idea of race and thereby eliminate racism altogether. I just think that we can get this statistical majority. How we get there just requires, at minimum, teaching the philosophies of race. I think that philosophy, when we think, some people think of philosophy and it seems kind of highfalutin, but we teach philosophies and we learn philosophies from the time we're very young, even when it's not called philosophy. I think that at a very young age, children, instead of teaching children race and thereby racism, we can teach them philosophies of race. That teaching them philosophies of race and also encouraging and creating a space that is both skeptical and eliminativist, meaning raceless, will then allow children to generate more productive ideas outside of the bounds of racism about themselves and about other people, about society, and about how things can and should look. Also, I think that every college student, at least in the US, should be required to take a philosophies of race course, because it does complicate and encourage people to interrogate the idea of race in ways that popular discourse and media and things like that disallow. And I think with those things happening, 2 basic things focus on really education, right? On those things happening, people will start to, for themselves, start to come to different conclusions because they're exposed to and recognize alternative ways of viewing race and alternative ways of viewing what should be done with race. The problem right now is in large part persisted because that information is kept from the vast majority of people. And, I don't know how my brain got me to where it did, but it did. But I could just imagine where I would be if I had been taught the philosophies of race, like well before my PhD, for example.
Is there any government policy you would support that would bring about more of this racelessness that you speak of?
Yeah, so the ironic thing, I don't know if you caught it earlier, but at some point I was talking about how ironically, when we're trying to solve racism, we tend to hyper focus on race, because in American society, we're just obsessed with race and color. And I say that it's ironic because those same policies have been proven to be ineffective in solving what we might point to and say this is systemic racism. And so part of what I'm advocating for and what I'm continuing on my own journey of doing more and more research as much as I can to arm myself with more knowledge is a better identification of what is racism, what's not racism, right? And in the instances where racism might be at hand or at play, what else is at play? Because we talk about intersectionality in America, that's a feminist term. We talk about intersectionality, but then the tendency is to point to something as being racist, and then that's like the end of the conversation. I think that if we point to something and say it's racist, that shouldn't be the end of the conversation. If anything, that should be the start of the conversation. We will then be encouraged to look at class, socioeconomic status, right? Other things, other aspects of the policies we might imagine that need to be in place to actually solve the problem. And right now I'm of the mindset that the policies that focus on race are not doing anything to solve racism, because there's evidence that shows that. So I think the policies that I would support would tend to be raceless in theory and in practice.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Mason. So, Kevin, I'm sure that answers your question. Stanley, Chloe, any more comments before we draw? Okay, someone else is trying to come in. Mr. Pelu. All right, we have Mr. Pelu. So, Mr. Pelu, welcome to the conversation. I noticed you've been listening since, so jump into the conversation. I believe you have an idea what we're talking about today. Hello, Mr. Pelu. And that name, Pelu, that name is a Nigerian name actually. It's
So, like,
Yoruba.
can I ask another question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Like one of the policy that I see that is very somewhat popular on the extreme, not so really extreme left, but somewhat on the left, is the idea of a universal healthcare system. Like some people that I see on the left that will somewhat take more of a class reductionist approach, say that allocating money specifically to Black people will not help, but more of a universal healthcare stuff that help both white people and Black people. It's more create the equity there that we're looking for. Is that something that you would support?
I haven't heard that argument about universal health care, but I support
Medicare for all?
Oh, I haven't
On the
heard.
burning left?
I've heard that. I haven't heard the argument that there was something you said at the core of that I guess the fact that it's universal, thereby it's not focusing on race, and it applies to everyone, that would be a more productive policy. But then there's, socialism, Marxism, those have become really dirty words in the American imagination. But I identify myself as indeed a socialist. But that is not to say, which means I support universal healthcare. Okay, let's be clear. But that is not to say that I think that American society has to do away with capitalism altogether, yada, yada. It's just that I recognize that some socialist practices and policies are actually beneficial. And if we look to other countries, Canada or different countries in Europe, for example, who have these sort of universal policies and procedures or practices, who are also not socialist countries by definition, we see that those kinds of things are helpful. So I think universal healthcare is on the list. I think free higher education. We shouldn't have to pay for education. I think that's on the list. I definitely support that.
This is very interesting. Because sometimes I think when people hear the word racelessness, they sometimes would associate it with colorblindness. And I'm aware that you made a distinction early on. But you come off very more, what I say, thoughtful than some people that I've listened to who try to dissect race, especially some people on the right that I've listened to. I think you've come out very thoughtful. I need to go back and listen to the beginning of this conversation.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, it's funny. I'm smiling because earlier when Charles was being a good interviewer and pushing back to get me to explain more of my position, this idea of color blindness is being interpreted as ignoring the problem in some way, or not acknowledging the existence of racism came up. And Charles and I were debating in a way whether or not that was true, that's how people see color blindness. But as you just articulated, it is. And I'm definitely, that's not this at all.
I appreciate.
All right. So, guys, we've done about 2 hours now. I think this is a very good place to draw the conversation to close. But before we draw the conversation to a close, let me just get words from Chloe, Stanley, Kevin, then Dr. Mason. You go last. Just recap and give us that line that you want us to take away from this conversation. Yeah. So, Chloe.
Yeah, I really, really did enjoy this conversation. We do need to examine our theories of race, because it's kind of like, it's been the water that we live in, and we don't realize that we're in water. And we need to kind of take a step away to really examine how these embedded concepts really constrain our conversations and constrain our conceptions of ourselves and how we move through the world. And to find the real problem, because even when I've been in situations in which at the time I perceived it was racist, but then having a step back, oh, this was the deeper problem. This was a problem that actually crossed across race and gender. Like, these other people were actually having a similar issue, but because I was thinking in terms of race, I was just perceiving that only I was having a problem in this sense, when other people were having a similar reaction to the real deep-rooted problem that was happening at that time. And, at that time, if I even conceived of that it really wasn't a race issue, even though maybe they were perceived they're pushing back on me based off my race, I could have, at least had a conversation with these other people to source the correct problem and maybe solve it at the time. So, I think we definitely need to recontextualize these conversations to find a more effective solution, or a way of mitigating or minimalizing the real problem.
Thank you very much, Chloe. Stanley.
I enjoyed it. Look forward to your book. And then I have one question, because I'm not a philosopher. Eliminativism, is that the same thing as eliminative materialism? Hello?
Yeah, is that you, Stanley?
Yeah. Eliminativism, is that the same thing as eliminative materialism?
No.
Okay. So your definition will be in the book.
It will, but I do want to be transparent that I didn't create the philosophies of race, so I didn't coin the words or anything. But right. I do expound and explain the positions, and I show various examples across history of the different positions as well.
Okay, because I looked it up on the Stanford Plato thing, and there is a term, eliminativism, and that's where I got confused. It's kind of like something to do with Descartes. So uh, anyway, that was my question, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stanley. So, Kevin B. Black.
Yes. I will definitely go back and watch over this conversation. I'm 100% sure it was a very interesting one. And Sheena, you will definitely see me. I will definitely email it because I really want to get more familiar with some of these concepts because I'm very interested in how some of these system works and how certain actions and inaction can perpetuate certain systems that sometimes we don't even want to perpetuate. So nice meeting you, and I'll keep in touch with you.
All right. Thank you very much, Chloe. Thank you very much, Stanley, Kevin B. Black. So now to our host, our guest for today, our special guest for today. So over to you, Dr. Mason.
Liberation is possible, and it starts within ourselves. That's my closing words of wisdom. Find me. I have my own podcast where I talk obnoxiously and obsessively about these very things. The link is in the description box. And if anyone else wants to contact me, that's a good way to contact me too. Just go to my website and shoot me an email.
All right. So it's been a pleasant conversation with Dr. Mason Sheena. Um, like she said, she has her own podcast on YouTube, and you can find her the podcast. The link is in the description. Also, the link to our website is in the description. And she also has a book which is going to come out early 2022. And I hope that you guys can go and buy her book and feed yourself on her ideas, which I think are very, very interesting. We're going to be having another conversation. Myself and Dr. Sheena are going to be having another conversation very soon, and it's going to be hosted in her channel. So I'd love you guys to come around as well, so that we'll make it more interesting and we just talk about these issues. And as usual, thank you very much, everyone who was on the platform today. Let me just mention some people. Nico Fabrice was here, Bob Marley was here, um, uh, Anan was here, Babe Rodriguez was here, those that commented, Marcos Darden was here, Mike Sens was here, the National Distributist was here, Vincent Alakija, oh, my good friend Vincent was here. It's been a very long time, Vincent. It's good to hear from you. Mr. Pelu was here. I was about saying something about Mr. Pelu. Um, Mr. Pelu, I think he's from, if I remember correctly, he's from Liberia. Um, his name is actually a Nigerian name. That's Pelu is a Yoruba Nigerian name. So, well, we're all connected somehow. So Jeff Horton was here, Marcus Darden was here. So thank you all for joining the conversation today. I believe that when people exchange ideas, we become better, we become smarter, and we make better choices. I don't believe that there is any idea that cannot be talked about, except unless it is totally abhorrent. But I believe that ideas should be discussed, should be debated, and somehow people would be able to make up their minds for themselves which idea is better, which is superior. But if we censor ideas, it allows negative things to fester in the hearts of uninformed people or bad people and make it to take roots, and that becomes a very big problem for society. So I always want to engender such discussions that are enlightening and are eye-opening, and that, as I would say, examining everything. So nothing is out of touch for me. I will examine everything and see how much it makes sense. So that's the conversation for today. So until next time, guys. Have a great day and remain awesome. Bye, Dr. Sheena.